Dublab.
Welcome to the Quarantine Tapes, a daily podcast from Onassis, LA and dublab. Hosted by Paul Holdengräber, this series chronicles shifting paradigms in the era of social distancing.
Hello?
Hello, could I please speak with Monet?
Yes, this is she. Hi.
Hello, Aja. What a pleasure to have you on the line. Thank you so much for being part of the Quarantine Tapes. I'm really delighted to add your voice to the series. Where do I find you?
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Where do I find you at the present moment?
I am currently in my room in Little Haiti, Miami.
And do you maintain relationships with the Haitian community there?
Yeah, we do a lot of work with organizations that are organizing for the Haitian community here, especially around TPS.
Do you know, I don't think I ever told you, but my parents spent the war years between 1939 and 1944 in Haiti, in Kenskoff.
Oh, really? I spent some time in Kenskoff after the earthquake that happened. I believe it was in 2010,
yes.
That January. We had organized to raise a bunch of money because the water was so bad. People did not have clean drinking water, so we raised money for a water filtration system. And then a friend of ours had family that lived in Haiti, and we went to go check on the filtration system and then spend time with their family. And her father is like, or her grandfather is like a very well-respected pastor of the town in Kenskoff. So we stayed with his family while we were there.
I wish my father were alive. For all I know, he might have known, if not the pastor, his father, if not his father, his grandfather. It was such a tight community. There was a very, very small Jewish community in Haiti, about 137 families, and my father was a farmer in Kenskoff. But enough about me. I want to turn directly, I had to mention this to you. I want to turn directly to you. You've said that you are inspired by June Jordan's revolutionary blueprint. What in fact is that blueprint, and how are you thinking about that blueprint at this moment?
That's a good question. Well, I started organizing in Florida with my partner. I started a arts collective out of our home, and it grew. And we originally just had an idea about doing a studio, and then we started doing like meetings and workshops, and seeing that I am a poet and recognizing that there was a void of I think poetry in the community from what I could see here. And a lot of the community organizers, my partner's a community organizer for an organization called Dream Defenders based here in Miami, Florida. And we work a lot with community organizers. And when I was, in conversation and going to meetings and being in relationship with a lot of organizers, I recognized that they were in a position where they were constantly stressed and responding to, every recent act of violence against their communities and constant just movement. And so there's not a lot of time to retreat and to reflect and to be introspective. And June Jordan was really integral in making sure that poetry wasn't just this solitary, you sit next to a tree in the middle of a woods by yourself in a cabin and write a poem, but that poetry is about how we relate to one another and how we communicate those really crucial unspoken truths that we share, and how we can better become a beloved community, a community of truth tellers, a community of justice seekers, a community of lovers and liberators, etc. And that in some way poetry would help us get to that point. And so I think the questions that she grappled with in her work and the actions that she took in her life was bring poets together and and to see the art of constructing a poem as the impetus for organizing a community. And so we follow in those footsteps of how can we get organizers who are grappling with so many interpersonal issues and emotional issues and political issues. Like, how can we start to lay that out, the interior landscape, and to discuss the way that shows up in the material conditions and lives that we live. We've learned a lot. We're continuing to learn, and we hope to evolve and to expand on the things that she was working on, because she was working out of an academic institution. And so, we struggle with and without resources,
Right.
a lot of times, fiscal resources, but we find ways to make most of what we have. And I think that has made better organized, better leaders, and people are really feeling agency and power, and not just how they show up to the rally or the riot, but how they show up for themselves.
Goodness, that was a fantastic response. You said that poetry taught you how to listen. And you quote John F. Kennedy, whose birthday it is today, who said, "When power corrupts, poetry cleanses." I'd like you to develop that a little bit.
Well, I think some of the things that I learned through poetry is through the many ways that poets have grappled with the great questions of life, And so I think poetry forces people to really take a deep look inward and then make an assessment about how we move outward and how we structure our systems and how we pursue justice and political integrity and all these things. So poetry has the capacity to really humble you, because it's not so much about the bravado of being the smartest person in the room or knowing all the answers or having the solution. It's really delving into the questions that are very philosophical at heart. I would say some of the greatest poets were philosophers, right? So it's grappling with the question of why are we here? What are we here for? What's our relationship to one another? How do we be better lovers and better, participants in our communities? But also, how do we be better creatures of the earth and treat the earth better and listen to the earth and recognize that we have a lot to learn from the earth, as much as we think that the earth is here to be stomped on and just service us. But how do we be of service? And so I think in that moment, JFK was actually reciting a speech in response to Robert Frost and saying that, paraphrasing, of course, but that any great nation that doesn't, celebrate its artists and its poets, at the very least, maybe not celebrate, but to support and create the infrastructure for them to exist, it's failing. And I think that's because poetry is supposed to not necessarily be right, but it helps us get to a moral compass and to understand who we are. And that's why it has that cleansing capacity, because power does corrupt, and power can blind and women.
No kidding. I'm reminded of that line of William Carlos Williams, who said it is difficult.
Yes,
it is difficult to get the news from poems, yet men die every day from lack of what is found there.
Die miserably every day for lack of what is found there. Yes, so true. There's a mentor of mine, Abia Dunawoli, of The Last Poet. They just had their 50th anniversary, which is ironic because uprising, nothing has really truly, fundamentally and institutionally and systematically changed. One of the things he says is, he shared with me one time was, if you want to see how ugly the world is, place something beautiful in it.
Wow,
and that
really... Who said this?
This is Abiodun Oyewole of The Last Poet. They're a poetry group that came out in the 60s,
Wonderful.
Late 60s. And
Wonderful.
Basically, they were very radical and truth tellers to the utmost, and really crucial to giving a voice to young Black men, particularly at this time after Malcolm X was murdered. So there's a lot that I've learned in mentorship from Abiodun as a godfather of sorts in my life. And one of the things that we would spend time talking about, is the role of poetry and where are we and what our people have, suffered through and what we've endured and what we've overcome and our resistance and our resilience, perseverance, all those things. But one of the things about that quote that really strikes me is that you see how, to put something beautiful into the world, by contrast, by virtue of the world, it does start to bring out what's ugly. You do start to see the things that are deteriorating around you. And I think that's a way that poetry works too and functions. It has this capacity to get you to focus on something so beautiful and so seemingly insignificant. And yet, by virtue of doing that, you really see how lovely life is when we focus on those things, but how horrible the conditions and the reality we live in, where we don't prioritize that care, that nurturing, that collectivism. None of those things are where our current civilization, and it's never been to the point where it needs to be, our society. But I do believe in people power, and I think that people are waking up and people have been organizing and have been resisting and have been strategizing for true justice. And that's part of the beauty. That is the beauty.
I had occasion to talk about this a little bit on the Quarantine Tapes, also with Saul Williams, to talk about the ugliness, though, to veer there. You recently wrote on Twitter just a few days ago, "Our children are inheriting a cemetery of hashtags." What did you mean, Aja? That's so strong.
I think, part of that comes from the climate that we're in, where our generation no generation prior to us has experienced these experiences in this way. So we are experiencing information and we're inundated with information constantly on our phones. We're scrolling through our screens, and a big part of that creates this disconnect and distance from everyday, lived experiences and people, real people. And I think a big part of why we have an uprising taking place right now from the murders of, not just the murder of George Floyd, but also Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery. And there's so many. The names just keep going. We could sit here all day and spend the whole conversation just listing names.
Yeah.
And that should be outrageous. That should frustrate and anger all of us. However, it's been, we've been sedated by, optics and sound bites and just, complacency and comfort and privilege. And so I think what I was trying to get to about that is that it's unfortunate that our young people are learning about injustice through hashtags. I think I am tired of seeing these same stories happen over and over again, and the brutality is just everywhere. It's so rampant, and you see these videos just being shared and shared and shared through media, and it's like, what more does this country expect of young Black people? At what point is the change going to actually take place? And you're going to listen. We tried peaceful protests in every possible. We've done the hashtags, we've done the posters, we've done the showing up to the vigils, and we've done the sitting down and having conversations and trying to vote people in and knocking on doors. And every which way we try, there is the stomping out of our voices. There's no listening. And it's very horrifying to hear that George Floyd died from his breath being strangled from him. The same with Eric Garner.
Yeah, and then you have a president at this moment who is treating things like thugs, all in caps, dishonoring the memory of George Floyd. What comes to your mind when you see such a cap? thugs. I mean, it seems. I mean, it reminded me of an extraordinary interview James Baldwin gave to Esquire in 1968, just after the assassination of Martin Luther King, where he writes, "The mass media, television, and all the major news agencies endlessly use that word, looter. On television, you always see black hands reaching in, and so the American public concludes that these savages are trying to steal everything from us, and no one has seriously tried to get where the trouble is. After all, you're accusing a captive population who has been robbed of everything of looting. I think it's obscene."
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, I wrote a essay or piece a while ago. This was in 2015 after the Baltimore uprisings, and it was called "The Love That Develops in a Foxhole." And a big part of it was responding to that very notion that somehow, Black people, uprising and young people taking to the streets and burning things down is savage, or some representation of us not being civilized, etc. And it's just straight up bullshit. It's not true. It's not only is it not true, it's inhumane, and it's completely dehumanizing, because at the end of the day, what more are people supposed to endure before they show you how heartbroken they are and you actually listen? Like, how much more do you expect people to take? This is our demonstration of love and care and preservation of our community. This is listen, this is pay attention, do something, change. And this could all stop tomorrow. If they really cared about Black people and their lives and their businesses and all this stuff that they claim to care about, we would have, these officers after officers after officers brought to justice. You have an entire new, security system in a way that we deal with policing in our neighborhoods. We would have justice, some change and some transformation. So you can't necessarily complain, because this is just a symptom of the issue. This is not the root. This is not the illness. This is not the sickness. We're dealing with the pandemic, a quote unquote pandemic happening, a global pandemic happening right now. And we're realizing, there's COVID-19, but white America's just waking up to the impact of this virus, when Black people have been dealing with the virus called, white terrorism and racism from inception of this country. So all these things that white people are just in their homes so terrified about, like not being able to move and not being able to go out where they want and how they wish and be mobile and buy what they want and do what they want. Like, welcome to the other America that you've never experienced and never heard of and seen. This is life. This is your America. This is your true America. You thought you was living in another America. You thought America was great. You thought America was this incredible nation. But let's get it down to the nitty gritty, which Black people have always known this country to be corrupt and to be, sitting on the backs of indigenous, people who they sacrificed lives for this country to succeed and be successful.
Aja, when I was speaking both to Baz Dreisinger and to Kianga Yamata-Taylor, they both brought up this notion of even using the word lockdown is a very problematic word to use, and certainly a word that African Americans understand intimately, but in a different way than just because of a pandemic. Yes,
there's so much that's happening in this moment that is, we could list and academically talk about all the breakdowns of the length.
Thankfully, we're not.
Yeah, but I think at the core of it, I don't understand how you can be a breathing, living, loving human being and not see what's happening in our current state of this country and not be outraged, not be upset, not be angry, not be called to action, not want to go out and do something and not be angry. That's human feeling. Those are emotions. Those are feelings. Those are valid. Those aren't things that you just make up in your head. So now everyone's facing this reality. And I think that that's great. But what really matters is not how people are terrified of this moment. You know, white people are trying to figure out, oh, what do I do? What do I do? But it's not what happens right now, you know, in this thick of protesting and people uprising. It's what happens in between these moments. You know, it's how you show up when there's no murder happening, when there's no hashtag being thrown around. You know, this is what the true measure of your humanity, your dignity is, how you show up and how you care, how you push the needle forward by voting in the right people, by working and collaborating in communities, by organizing and showing up with grassroots leaders, by, you know, holding accountable, you know, racist, terrorist terminology in any form and fashion. So there's ways to show up before these moments, and I think we failed miserably with each other as human beings.
You know, you said we can go back to things the way they were. We must be and do life differently. We must, you say, become artists. I'm wondering what you mean by artists in this context, what it would mean to become artists.
I don't mean it in the bourgeois, you know, status of being an artist, right? But I do mean in the sense that we must democratize art, and that art in its true function. I mean, this is why artists, the ones that I adore, that the ones that I think are really making meaningful art, are the ones that are ostracized from communities, that are pushing the envelope and are challenging the status quo and are putting art in places for the people to experience and see and understand and have relationship to. But I'm more of the frame of thinking that art needs to be public and in relationship with the public and with the people. So artists should be commissioned to design the streetlights, and to be commissioned to do, you know, public services. That art should be integrated in all aspects of our life. That it shouldn't be left to elite institutions and something you get to do as an elective in your high school, but it's something that's very fundamental and seen as a practical, strategic way of engaging, you know, human life and any job, really. That the skill sets you learn from creating and working with artists are skill sets that fundamentally ground us in connectivity to our senses, to our relationships to one another, to our hands, to being useful, to being of service, to finding the skill sets you have and exercising those skill sets. And that art should be used in every facet. So whether, you know, cook a meal for someone, if you think that maybe you're not the person, that maybe you're sick and you can't go out to the rally, and you can't, but you might be able to write letters, you might be able to call, you might be able to design a flyer, you might be able to, there's so many things, but to do it artfully, to do it with passion and with joy and with enthusiasm, that's pretty much what I mean. You know, that you have to sit there with that same, you ever see an artist that's so fixated? I mean, it's almost a little crazy that they are just so fixated on that dot or that color or that, if you have to have that sort of focus and that sort of precision that brings forth, I think, the transformational justice and change we want to see. And that's where I feel like I'm talking about artists in that way, that we become artists in that way.
I thought so. And you've said I've had poems that I've read, or even that I've written, where it has uprooted an entire belief system or disrupted a certain narrative that we are taught is supposed to be the dominant narrative. In closing, Aja, might I ask you to recite one of your poems that might be able to do that?
Oh, Lord.
Oh, Lord, I put you on the spot. Something that,
yes,
I did, but you know what? I think you can live up to that challenge.
Oh, man. Where do I begin? So there's a poem that I'm going to read. I don't think I'll read all of it because it's a little long, but people can go find it online. And it's called Injustice. And it's basically about, there's a poem that Audre Lorde wrote called Power. And in that poem, she says the difference between poetry and rhetoric is being ready to kill yourself instead of your children. And I grappled with this a lot because I thought of I had gone through a moment where I had, to consider whether or not I would bring a child into the world, and the question of that, and thinking about power and different people's relationship to power based off of their economic status, also based off of their race, and how that decides whether or not somebody's able to bring a child into the world, etc. And in that, I also grappled with the poet's power, whether or not poetry had power, and then where a poet's power lies. And I think a poet's power is in their ability to tell the truth and to use everything in their poetic arsenal to try to shift the conditions of the poor, the abused, or the oppressed, to balance the scales of justice by telling the truth. So here's the poem, and I remember it's going to be cut off. So, if you want to read the rest, go online.
Thank you in advance.
Yes. So it's called Injustice After Power by Audre Lorde. Howling in the wound of words, a tongue trembles with the tension of truth. The difference between poetry and rhetoric is there's a world outside your door, knocking inward. A voice hungers fearless, wooed by courage, a deliberate impulse, the ability to turn a knob, alter or shift an action. A window is a mirror of risk. A poet writes to balance the scales of power, yet feels the absence of power. Perhaps instead of rape, I ought to say, he forced the sweating throb, liquored moans, mingled mourning, a roofy stone, turned me inside out. Studded wet, worn too tight, busted, bruised, came and went. I was a ghost, a rage no one can see. I killed myself a little to enter the memory so close. I choose not to resurrect the devil in details. And the country, still a culture of take or be taken violently. The United States is a forced entry on stolen land. The Supreme Court weaponizes words against flesh, and law is made. Still, a poem is not a knife or gun or food, unless the knife or gun is a pen or clothes. A pen is only a sword of feelings, not a home, not louder than a bomb. It's not flesh or blood, not a condom or pill. Cannot unrape you, nor undo your doing. Yet a poem is a doing still. Warbling within an ear, an eye, mouth, or touch, a living beneath words. How we respond to power reveals our power. More or less, a flex, relinquished tug, push, pull, demand, plead, a wrist dancing between fist and open palm to kill or be sacrificed. Murder is murder. A poet writes to balance the scales. Any child that dies cannot undie in a poem, nor can a jury untie our children. There are no words to heal or bring back the dead. Remember, you cannot unkill a part of yourself with dreams or kisses, poetry, or rhetoric, awards of accolades, pensions, money or comfort, marches or protests, judges or prisons. Losing a child is a suicide. The whole world silent, a voice lost in the difference between killing yourself and killing yourself, love and death. What we resist will amend or slaughter us, and there will be others. There were others. What say Audre Lorde to Margaret Garner of power? The difference between poetry or rhetoric is a choice between lesser evils. Power is in the wave that moves. The way change is God, so is a spirit. The more, or like love, the more you control, the more it controls you. The difference between poetry and rhetoric is Darin Tator, because a poem is not a knife or gun or bomb, yet a poem can so enrage a nation to imprison a poet who attempts to balance the scales, agitates the people power to do the change. When a foot is on your neck, it does not matter how you get it off, what words you say, what weapons you use, knife or pen, so long as you do is survival. And it becomes less and less important what someone else thinks about how you resist, unless, of course, they are willing to take the foot off your neck, too.
Wow. When did you write this?
This was actually, thank you for asking, because I wrote it when, do you remember when they were trying to take one of the Supreme Court judges that suggestion, I think it was Brett something, they were trying to see if they were going to choose him, or Trump was trying to suggest the Supreme Court judge or something, and he was being accused of, yes, Kavanaugh. And it was this time, and I was abroad, and I had read this poem by Audre Lorde, and at the same time, I was also thinking about Darin Tator, who was this poet who, wrote on her page, in her poem, she had a line on Facebook, Palestinian poet, she wrote, "Resist, my people, resist." And they arrested her for that poem. And it was because they said she was inciting violence. And it was at the time where there was all these uprisings around, the Israeli government trying to change the U.S. embassy and all this stuff. So it was, for me, the poem was also just about how everybody has an opinion about how people resist. Everybody wants to look back and be a spectator. But when a foot is on somebody's neck, all somebody's concerned about is getting it off. Right. They don't really care. There only comes for so long when you say, "Please get off, please, please, please," and then you're searching for whatever's near you to try to punch the foot off your neck, to grab it. If a knife is near you, if a gun's near you, whatever's near you, you're going to use it to try to get that foot off your neck because you're trying to survive. You're trying to live. You're trying to breathe. And I think what I wanted to get across that we learned through Palestinian organizers is you can't sit around telling people how to respond to violence if you're not trying to stop the violence yourself.
Aja, my goodness. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah,
I know.
Yeah.
No, but thank you. I express my gratitude to you. It's been wonderful to talk to you, and I send you for the moment a virtual hug, and hope that at some point our paths cross again. It's really been a pleasure speaking to you, and thank you for your clarity and passion and insight. Take care of yourself.
Thank you. Thank you. You too.
All the best to you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
To support this show and Dublab's progressive programming, go to dublab.com/support.